Today we're going to be reviewing the Toyota 4Runner. Now while most car reviewers would complain of the 4Runner's age, we're going to be taking a look under the hood and underneath the 4Runner to see why the sales of this traditional body-on-frame SUV have been dramatically increasing as this vehicle ages. And we're going to start under the hood where we have the tried and true 1GR FE 4-liter V6 engine situated in the middle of the engine bay longitudinally for a rear-wheel drive layout. Now taking a look at some of the components under the hood, we've got the air pump located here, we've got a power steering pump reservoir, we've got the windshield washer tank, the coolant tank over here, we've got your air box over here, and this big air resonator that sits on top of the engine. Over on this side we've got our brake master cylinder, our fuse box, and our battery. Notice how there's no computers located under the hood. Now we're going to start by examining the air intake setup, which is pretty simple. We've got fresh air that's drawn in from the side of this fender here. It'll then come into this air box to get filtered out, pass through the mass airflow sensor. There's a air resonator here that tees off of this tube here. It'll then go into this drive-by-wire throttle body and then directly into this plastic intake plenum to get distributed down in the middle of the engine. Now changing an air filter on this is even easier than on a Corolla. You just have to remove these tabs here and then just pop this up and peel out the air filter. It's weird, this air filter has got a felt pad to filter out the air before it gets filtered out. Now with the air intake removed, we have clear access to this drive-by-wire throttle body. You can also clearly see this plastic intake plenum as it joins to the lower metal intake plenum here before going down into the engine to get burned. We've got this little PCV line that ventilates to the airbox. Now looking over on the driver's side of the engine, we've got another ventilation hose for the PCV system. We've also got the purge valve for the evap system that'll lead up behind the throttle body. Taking a look at the fuel system on the 4Runner, things are pretty simple because this is only a port injected engine. You can see here we've got the fuel line that'll come into this little fuel damper and go directly into this fuel rail here. Here you can see we've got the 3 fuel injectors for this bank of cylinders, and there's another fuel rail buried under this plastic intake manifold for the other side. Now looking in between the V here, you can see where this plastic fuel rail is going to join over to the other rail underneath this intake plenum on this side to feed these 3 cylinders. Now as part of the emission systems, this vehicle also has an air pump located off to the side here, and it's going to tee off to this air control valve sitting on top of the right hand valve cover, which goes down to a pipe on this side of the engine. And here on the left side of the engine we have another air control valve. Now looking on top of the 4Runner's engine, we do have metal valve covers, which is pretty rare for a brand new vehicle. Now this vehicle does take 0W 20 weight oil over here, and we've got the dipstick located over here. Now taking a look at the underside of the 4Runner, you can see that it's mostly flat. There are some nice air pockets here to allow air to vent in and cool things off. The underbody cladding is actually made of a nice metal, so that protects any engine components, but that only goes to the back of the engine. The rest of the drivetrain behind there is completely exposed. Now once those pieces are removed, you can see they actually gave you a jack point here, so you can jack up and get straight to the frame. Unfortunately, this piece has to be removed, and it's pretty heavy in order to access the oil filter underneath the vehicle. At least for the drain plug, they do give you an access port. Now with those engine covers removed, you can see you've got clear access under the engine. We've got the drain plug located at the back here, and we've got the oil filter located over here. Now this is a cartridge style oil filter, which means that you have to first of all get a special tool to loosen this off, and then you can remove the cartridge. It's going to be a little messy. You change the cartridge out and then screw it back in. Now changing spark plugs is pretty straightforward on the 4Runner, especially on the right side here. You just got to remove this air valve, and you've got easy access to the 3 ignition coils on this side of the engine. Now on the driver's side of the engine, spark plugs are a little bit more tight because you do have this air intake plenum on the way. However, once the air valve from this side is removed, you still should have pretty easy access to the ignition coils on this side because this plenum is pretty high up and you should be able to get in there without removing it. Now taking a look at the front of the engine here, underneath this timing cover is a timing chain, which is good because you don't have to do a timing belt service over the life of the engine. Now the only major mechanical update to this vehicle was the addition of dual VVTi, which means that you've got your intake cams on this side over here, and then on the outsides you have your exhaust cam, and they're both adjustable for timing. On the driver's side you can see the oil control valve for the exhaust side. The other one's buried under this plenum. On the passenger side, it's pretty easy to see the intake and the exhaust oil control valve. Now just in front of that timing chain is the accessory drive belt setup. You can see here we've got the alternator located over here and an idler pulley. Further down below that we have the AC compressor. Now in the middle of that, underneath this big jumble of coolant mess, is the water pump, which is actually attached to this mechanical fan. That's right, this fan is actually belt driven, it's not electric. And then on this side of the engine we have the power steering pump. Now once this coolant mess is out of the way, especially this fan here, you should have pretty easy access to change out that belt because there's a lot of room from behind the radiator to the front of the engine here to work. Now changing the alternator on this truck's pretty straightforward. There are two main bolts that hold it in, but there's a bunch of stuff that you got to remove. You're pretty close to the upper control arm over here, so things do get pretty tight when you have to work to remove the brackets for these wires. Now the AC compressor is best serviced from down below. Once you remove the covers, there's 4 bolts that bolt it to the block, and it should drop right out. And here's a look at that drive belt setup from down below. You can see we've got easier access to this AC compressor. And looking from the passenger side, we've got the drive belt set up here. You can see the crank pulley over here and the power steering pump located over here. And now we'll have a listen to the startup. Now taking a general look under the hood of the 4Runner, you can see things are laid out pretty simple with not that much plastics or electronics to worry about. You probably wouldn't even find this simplicity on a German car even from 40 years ago. It just goes to show the Toyota's dedication to reliability when things are pretty old school. You just have one simple wiring harness that connects to the ECU, which is located down underneath the glove box where it should be, in my opinion, out of the elements and away from any potential collision damage. The only other wiring harness is this one here for all the body control. Now continuing with that simplicity, you've got the relay box located over here. Everything's nicely labeled and laid out, and a smaller relay box over here. So if you've got to diagnose everything, it's pretty simple and easy to work on. Now taking a look at the exhaust system on the 4Runner, you can see we've got this exhaust manifold located outside the head. It's not integrated into the head, before the gases will flow down into the catalytic converter down below. And here's a look at the driver's side exhaust manifold. There's a little bit more stuff in the way because of this intake plenum. Now that exhaust is then going to continue down to the secondary catalytic converter for the left bank, and then join over here through the right side catalytic converter, and then into one pipe down into the muffler. And here's another look at that exhaust where the 2 pipes join at this Y pipe over here and then go out to the muffler. Now from the muffler, the exhaust is going to flow over the rear axle and then out the tailpipe at the back here. And now we'll have a listen to the exhaust. Next up, we'll take a look at the transmission on the 4Runner, which is a joke because it still uses a 5-speed automatic transmission. Regardless, the drain plug is located at the bottom here and the check plug is located here. You pull out at the current temperature to drain out any excess fluid. We've also got a fill plug located on the side, which means that you just can use a regular pump to push fluid in. Now the 4Runner's got a built-in transmission cooler. You've got these 2 lines here. They're going to take fluid out to the radiator. Now just behind the prop shaft, you can see we have the cable to select the gears. There's no electronic selection here. Now once the transmission is done shifting its gears, it's then going to send its power out to the transfer case. Now because this is a true off-road vehicle, it does have a low range gear transfer for the 4-wheel drive system. So that's going to transfer power over to this prop shaft here, which is going to go up to the front differential. Now that power is going to be sent over to this front differential, which is then going to go out to the CV axles to the front wheels. Now servicing this differential is pretty easy. We have a fill port located up here and the drain port located down here. Now further behind this towards the middle, we have the disconnect for electronically disconnecting the 2 front wheels so they spin independently of each other. Now taking a look at the transfer case from the back here, you can see changing its fluids pretty simple. We've got a fill port here and a drain port down here. Now the transfer case is electronically selectable, so it uses this electric motor here to switch its planetary gear set inside in order to select your gear. There's no cable over here. Now once the transfer case has done its job, it's then going to send its power to the rear through this drive shaft. Now all that power from the transfer case is going to be sent to the back here at the rear differential. Now nice and old school, we've got a solid axle back here, no electronics, actuators, or solenoids. You got a fill plug located over here and a drain plug located down there for service. Now with a solid axle design, you can see that the shaft inside is completely encased, and there's no question that this vehicle is going to handle really high torque, especially in 4-low off-road. Now unfortunately, the hardest job on the 4Runner is actually replacing the starter. It's located up inside of here underneath the left-hand manifold, which means that you have to remove that exhaust manifold in order to get access to it. Now it's interesting to see the body on frame construction of the 4Runner. You can see we have the ladder-like cross members that go here, and then the frame rails that run up along the side. Even up at the front here, we have another cross member. We have the radiator support cross member, and then the bumper rebar located right at the bottom of the bumper because this vehicle sits pretty high. Taking a look at the front suspension from underneath, you can see we've got a stamped steel lower control arm here, and its cam bolt where it attaches to the frame. Now if you look at the knuckle, you can see it is made of cast steel. However, the bearing is a pressed in design, which means that you can't just unbolt the hub. You need to put it on a press to change it out. Furthermore, changing this ball joint is going to be a little involved. The bottom part of it bolts to the knuckle, but the top part of it is pressed into the control arm here. Now, ball joints were a weak spot on Toyota trucks, so you make sure you check that out if you have one of these trucks. Now, they do an interesting design where they have a head here that's a forged piece that's actually welded to the stamped steel design. Now, the strut is going to attach to the lower control arm over here, but check out this reduction in area here. This tiny little bit of rod here is what's holding up your vehicle through the shock. Now, taking a look at the 4Runner's front suspension, we do have an independent style double wishbone front suspension. So at the top here we have a upper control arm, which is stamped steel. We have the strut located inside of this pocket here, and this pocket's actually part of this frame. It's not connected to the body because this is a body on frame vehicle. Now, the bottom of that strut is going to join to the lower control arm down here. Since this is a longitudinal vehicle, we have front steer, which means the inner and outer tie rods sit in the front of the vehicle. Now, over here we've got a steel steering knuckle that joins to the upper control arm. We have the stabilizer link that joins to this sway bar. Now, in some models of the 4Runner, there's something called kinematic dynamic suspension system, which is actually a fluid-based system to transfer some of the sway bars motion to the rear and to the front, and that'll allow for better articulation off-road. Now, down below here we have the steel control arm and the bump stop, and we've also got the drive axle, which is a nice chunky axle coming out here. One thing that's kind of ugly is the way they put this sound deadening material, just like they just lathered it on with a paintbrush. There's no real design or pattern or neatness to it. I don't really like that. Now, changing an upper control arm of this car is a little interesting. There's actually one long pivot bolt that runs right through to this nut on the other side. So you just got to make sure that you got enough clearance to pull this bolt through in order to get this arm out. Now, taking a look at the rear suspension on the 4Runner, things are pretty simple back here because we have a solid axle. That's right, this still uses a solid axle suspension, which is good for off-road and articulation, and it's pretty sturdy overall. You can see, other than the solid axle, we have the spring located inbound over here. We have the shock absorber over here, and in the corner here we have the stabilizer link and the sway bar that goes over to the other side. Now, the only thing really holding this axle to the body is this lower control arm or trailing arm that ties the body to the axle over here to prevent it from shifting this way during braking and acceleration. The only other link connecting it is this panhard rod, which ties the body on this side to the axle over on that side to prevent lateral motion. Now, taking a look at the suspension from underneath, up here we have the bump stop that'll touch the axle when you bottom out. Now, the knuckle itself is made of steel and it bolts directly over to this flange over here on the axle. Now, of course, if you got to change bearings, you will definitely need a press. Now, overall, with a solid rear axle paired with that double wishbone front suspension, you'll get really good articulation off-road, especially when you pair it with the body on frame nature of this SUV and a proper four-wheel drive system. The downside to this, however, especially in the front, is that parts are going to be a little bit more expensive to replace, as well as be a little bit more labor intensive. Now, back here things are a little bit more simple to work on, with the exception of changing the hubs. Next up, we're going to take a look at the 4Runner's cooling system, and it is pretty straightforward. Here we've got the coolant reservoir, we've got the upper radiator hose located over here. Now, the radiator cap is just buried under this little bulge under this plastic trim, which you have to remove if you want to top off your radiator. Now, the lower radiator hose is going to bring coolant up from the bottom there into this plastic housing, which houses the thermostat. It'll then travel over to this water inlet assembly, which is also the exit for the upper radiator hose, before exchanging fluid with the block. Now, of course, we've also got other lines that tee off of here for the transmission and oil coolers, and we've also got the two lines for the heater cord that run off the back of the block. And here's a look at that cooling fan from down below. Now, at least the radiator has a petcock valve for easy coolant changes, unlike a Jeep where you actually have to pull the hose. And here's a look at the radiator and the condenser from the front. Unfortunately, if you do have to remove this radiator, although it does sit behind the radiator support, you still have to remove the front bumper assembly in order to completely access it. There's a lot of stuff you got to disconnect if you have to change it out. Now, behind that radiator, there's a single cooling fan. Now, this is pretty old school because it's actually driven off of the belt from the water pump pulley located inside of here. Now, inside of here is a fluid coupling, and as the temperature warms up, it's actually going to couple the fan belt to the actual fan and rev up the fan. That's also why you can hear the fan spin up when you rev the engine when you're driving. Now, accessing the water pump on a GR series engine is pretty intricate. It's actually located down inside of here, and you need to remove all of the accessories in the front of the engine, including all the idler pulleys, the alternator, the AC compressor, and even the power steering pump from the other side in order to access all the bolts for this water pump. It's quite an involved job. Now next up we're going to take a look at the 4Runner's braking system. Now things do look a little non-traditional here because I don't really see any vacuum lines coming from this little reservoir over here going over to the engine, so it's probably all a self-contained unit. Now the master cylinder that joins that booster is inside of here, but it also integrates the ABS unit. You can see its computer is located over here. At the front of the unit you can see you've got the 4 lines that'll go directly to the 4 wheels, as opposed to just the 2 lines that normally come out of a master cylinder. So if this master cylinder goes bad, it's going to be one expensive module to replace, as it has been on older Lexus models. Now looking at the 4Runner's brakes, we do have a double piston design. Now this is a fixed caliper, and the pads themselves actually float with this disc rotor. Now in my opinion, these brakes are a little bit small for the size and weight of this vehicle. It actually feels really difficult to stop when you're driving this. Now the rear brakes on the 4Runner are just as weak as the front. We have a small single piston caliper over here on this disc rotor. Now inside this rotor here we have a drum that houses the old school manual cable operated parking brake. You can see the cables over here. Next up we'll take a look at the power steering setup on the 4Runner, and you can definitely tell how this vehicle is aged. It still uses hydraulic power steering fluid. Most other vehicles just use an electric motor built onto the rack. Now if you follow those hydraulic lines, it leads up to the power steering pump on the passenger side of the engine. Now if I have to replace this pump, it's pretty straightforward. There's just a couple of bolts that hold it to the block, and once I get the lines off, it should just come right off. There is a lot of room to work inside of here. Now just above the front frame you can see the steering rack, which is mounted over here. It'll then feed out to the tie rods in front of the wheel hub to each wheel. Now looking at the fuel tank underneath the 4Runner, it's only on the driver's side over here. Now the tank itself is made of steel, and additionally there is a steel liner underneath to protect it. Now if you do need to access the low pressure fuel pump or filter inside, you do have to drop the tank down because this is a body on frame vehicle, so you can't access it from in the body. Now with the fuel tank over there, if you follow the lines, just up underneath the spare tire is where the evap canister is located. Looks like this here is the safety chain for when you lower the tire down from the inside there. This kind of holds on to it. Now let's be honest, the interior does leave a lot to be desired. In terms of build quality, there's a lot of scratchy plastics, but that's not necessarily why you would buy a 4Runner. Now the real reason why you'd buy a 4Runner is not just because of what's under the hood, but also what's underneath. The body on frame construction, the part-time 4-wheel drive system, as well as the old school solid axle suspension really makes this vehicle capable off-road, which is really where it deserves to be. Now if you pair that with Toyota's excellent reputation for reliability, especially with the tried and true GR series of V6 engines, along with a really good engine layout, relatively simple electronics under the hood, and pretty good build quality overall, I think the 4Runner is definitely a win in my books, especially for owners who want to own this long term and work on the vehicles themselves. Now you tell me in the comment section down below, what do you think of the 4Runner? Do you think that it's fallen behind its times, or do you think that its tried and true methodology is actually a good thing, especially in a segment that doesn't really exist anymore? Now make sure you follow me on Instagram for more behind the scenes footage, and subscribe for more videos just like this one.